So I moved to Jersey City a little more than a year ago, and I remember as I was familiarized, I'd never lived here before, didn't know much about the city or what was going on or the different institutions here. And I remember driving by and seeing this particular school, and the title of the school, or the name of the school, the Beloved School, and I said, that's a weird name for a school. I figured, well, it must just not be a white thing, so why would I understand? And then as we went, I educated myself and came to kind of understand what, things I didn't know before, and I learned it's not a random name. It's actually a name that came from a theme of Dr. Martin Luther King. And one of the things he would talk about over and over again, in one of those times was in 1957, he was speaking at a rally following the Supreme Court victory that his movement had that upheld the illegality of bus segregation. This was a case that started with Rosa Parks in Alabama and made it all the way up to the Supreme Court over the course of years. And finally, the Supreme Court upheld the decision of the lower court and said that public school or public bus segregation is absolutely illegal. And so they had a rally in celebration of that. And in it he said, the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. This is the type of spirit, and this is the type of love that can transform opponents into friends. This is the type of understanding and goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. This is the love that will bring about the miracles in the hearts of men. The idea of the beloved community was this vision of a community of people where it's not the vanquished suffering at the hands of the victors. It's not the winners celebrating at the expense of the losers. It's not the oppressors enjoying the fruits of their oppression, but it's where humans have gathered together for the common good and are working together for the good of all people everywhere. It's essentially the American ideal, such as it is, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the reason that's an American ideal is because it was a Christian ideal, that we're all made in God's image and that we're all made to seek Him, to know Him, and to find Him. And that's why it resonates deeply, the idea of the beloved community resonates deeply across belief systems and across populations and across cultures of all different sorts and of all different shapes. Because we humans are communal creatures. One of the things it means to be human is that we actually can't survive without other people. None of us is an island. We need connections with other people. And to be excluded from the community of others is to be put on the margins, to be put at risk. And on the other hand, the quality of our life is basically summed up by the quality of our relationships. The richness of our life is essentially summed up by the richness of our relationships. And our individual well-being is inevitably tied to the well-being of the communities that we find ourselves a part of. And that's why the vision of the beloved community, a community where it's not that the winners trample on the losers, but where everybody is together working for a higher good, is something that resonates so deeply. Who knows what the most successful song, the highest grossing song that John Lennon ever had was? Jonathan knows. Where's Jonathan?
Is it Imagine?
It's Imagine.
Yeah.
It's Imagine, yeah. John Lennon sang the song visualizing this new world in 1971. Where he kind of gives this vision of this celestial utopia, and he says, imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of men. Imagine all the people sharing all the world, You might say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. One day I hope you'll join us and the world will be as one. So that's the ideal, the human ideal. It's not and I believe it's a human ideal because regardless of how we articulate our faith, all of us have a sense of God's ideal in us that we're all longing for, that we're all looking for in our own way. I think there's a broad agreement deep in the human heart that this is what we want, a beloved community, a harmonious community, a unified community where all of us are together. We can imagine it, we can dream about it, we can talk about it, but the thing that I've observed is it's just not happening. It's just not realistic. One of the things I've learned from history is that we actually don't learn anything from history. When I was a young man, I had the opportunity to travel in Europe, and one of the things you got to do when you're traveling through Germany and other places is you got to go to the old concentration camps, to Dachau, to Auschwitz, and all these places are set up as museums. That are maintained by people who want us to remember the horrors of the Holocaust. And the theme of those places is we've got to remember these things so we never repeat them. And I remember as a young man, obviously you go there and you're sickened and you're outraged and your mind is boggled by the evil of what humans can do to one another when we allow ourselves to. It's a disturbing thing to see. And yet the theme of the place is we got to remember this so that it never happens again. And I thought to myself, well, of course, now we know that this can happen, so it's never going to happen again, right? We're done with this. And so my mind was boggled when just a couple of years after that, within driving distance of Dachau in southern Germany, in Bosnia Herzegovina, there was a war in 92 and 93 that involved more ethnic cleansing, and over 200,000 civilians were killed in an effort to eradicate by the Serbs in an effort to eradicate the Muslim population there. That was in Europe in 1992. Another mini Holocaust. 200,000 people killed in connection with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And, you look around the world, just in current events, in Africa, in Darfur, and in Rwanda, over 1 million people were killed in the last couple of years in ethnic cleansing efforts. In the Middle East, in the Syrian war, 500,000 civilians have already died. And that's essentially a religious war between two different flavors of Islam. Right now, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but it blows my mind to think about the fact that right now in Burma, Myanmar, the former Burma, there's a war going on, there's ethnic cleansing going on, and tens of thousands of people have been killed in that as well. So it's as much as John Lennon sings about, as much as we might talk about and agree on this, as much as we might study the Holocaust and say never, ever, ever again, we live in a broken world and we can't help ourselves from perpetuating these things at a global level, at a massive level. And then at a micro level, I find it's also true. Because we can talk about the need for nations and ethnic groups to get along, but the other thing we need is we need families to get along. And we need brothers and sisters to get along. We need husbands and wives to get along. We need sons, parents and children to get along. And for all of us, I think everybody wants that. And yet, it's all of our experience, I think, that some of those closest relationships, some of those most important relationships, we just can't make them work. And our lives are hurt and our lives are broken because we're experiencing brokenness at that very fundamental, very microscopic, very personal level. And that's the world that we live in. This is the conundrum, is that we're communal creatures, We're made for relationships. Our relationships define us. Our relationships identify us. Our relationships are the basis of our security. And yet our relationships are all so broken. The relationships between nations, the relationships between ethnic groups, and even the relationships between brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and all of that as well. And this is the heartbreak of most of our lives. If we were to go around and people were to be honest about what's burdening your life and what's burdening your heart right now, I think probably in most of us it will come down to someone who's related to us, someone was a very close friend or a relative who we're not on speaking terms with, who we're no longer connected to. And and the question is, what's the solution? One of the things that's universally recognized is that religion's not the solution. In fact, John Lennon's vision was that the eradication of religion is the solution. He said, imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You might say I'm a dreamer. So John Lennon's vision was, well, if we could just get rid of religion, there's something to that. You think of all the wars that have been sparked even today, wars that and conflicts that are based in a difference of religion. It might seem that if we could just get away from religion, that might solve all the problems. But and that's something I've noticed even within America, and it's as much as it's hard for me to comprehend why Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims would be at war with each other and would be killing each other. On the other hand, I had a conversation with a guy just a couple weeks ago who didn't have a background in the West and in Christianity. He's like, well, what's the difference really between Protestants and Catholics? And it was just hard for me to say in a way that made any sense to someone else what the differences are between even within Christianity. But Martin Luther King, you got to appreciate him because he believed that the resources for change were in our faith, and he believed his message was that the highest ideals of the Christian faith and the highest ideals of the Bible are what are going to be the basis for creating the beloved community. And that's why, and that was essentially his message through his life. But that's also why he was so discouraged and so upset at a certain point in his life. He got thrown into jail in Birmingham as part of the civil rights protest. And they just basically left him there. He didn't get the due process he needed. So he had time to write a letter. And he wrote a letter, which is actually one of an important piece of American history, called The Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Maybe you have heard of that. And the letter from a Birmingham jail is actually Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King writing to all the rest of the clergy in Alabama and saying, I'm in jail. Where are you? Why aren't you with me on this? You know what's right. You know what's good. And why are you just letting things go? And it's actually, you should look it up, and you ought to read it. It'll be a good MLK weekend activity for you. But he's just saying, where's your faith? Where are your principles? At one point he says this: in the midst of this mighty struggle to rid our nation of racism and injustice, I've heard so many ministers say, those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with. And I've watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, between the sacred and the secular. And what he's saying is, all of these ministers I talk to who agree with me in principle, who say they are committed to the same things, where are you, and why aren't you willing to do anything about this? He goes on to say that he thinks the biggest threat to the civil rights movement was not necessarily the racists, because their numbers were diminishing. It was the moderates, the people who say, well, we agree with you in principle, but we just don't want to do anything about it. We just got to let the status quo stand for a while. But what Martin Luther King understood was that the job of the church, the job of the gospel, is to create the beloved community. Because the love in the beloved community is not something we work up in and of ourselves. That's what Jesus came to do. That's what God calls us to do, and that's what God calls us to be. That's the result of the gospel working in our lives. He says, people want to make a strange distinction between bodies and souls, between the sacred and the secular. But what the Bible invites us to do is see that Jesus came to redeem our bodies and our souls. And what Jesus came to do and what God is at work on is establishing his lordship over every square inch of this universe. And sometimes the way we do his work is in the secular world and in the practical world. I think everybody agrees that this is an ideal at some level. And this was MLK's frustration with guys like me, the established clergy, is you agree with this at some level, but we really don't want to do it in reality because it seems like it's too hard. Reconciliation is too expensive, so why should we bother with that? Redemption is too difficult, so we can't redeem ourselves. The easiest way for me to justify myself is by simply condemning someone else. And if I can just condemn someone else, then I can feel better about myself. And the best way to secure my place in the world is by excluding someone else. And so we settle for a cheap justification, a cut-rate redemption, and we look for an easy scapegoat to blame instead of pulling together. And that shows the reality of our poverty, and it also, I think, shows what it is that your heart needs and what it is that my heart needs and what we're actually looking for. Look at 1 John 4, 7 through 12. This is just an important passage. I think this might have been what he had in mind when he talked about the beloved community. He says, "Dear friends, let us love one another because love comes from God. And everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God because God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his one and only Son so that we might live through him. Love consists in this, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, if God loved us in this way, we also must love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God remains in us, and his love is complete in us. If we love one another, then God remains in us. Then his love is complete in us." See, what the Bible says, what the New Testament says, is you can't say you have a connection with God and a love for God if you don't love the children of God around you. You can't have love for God and say God's love is in your heart and have contempt for other people. That's at the heart of what the Christian life is. But I heard someone put it this way this week. He said, here's the thing about the gospel, about understanding the gospel. On the one hand, as we understand the gospel will make us the most cynical people about the human prospect. They'll say, Holocaust and ethnic cleansing and wars have been happening and divisions have been happening throughout the history of humanity, and they're going to just continue to happen, and there's nothing that we can do about it. We might as well just hunker down and try to protect our own. Because there's a lot in history to be cynical about. But at the same time, if you understand the gospel, if you believe the gospel, if you believe the vision that the Bible gives us for what we're supposed to be, then you'll understand that God is in the business of creating peace. God is in the business of bringing reconciliation. God is working to create a beloved community. And you see the picture of heaven, a picture of a congregation with every tribe, tongue, and nation gathering together and saying, "Worthy is the Lamb," and you say, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. And then when you pray the prayer and you say, "God, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," you realize that's what we're supposed to work for. That's what we're supposed to hope for. And that's what we're supposed to believe in. Because that's what Jesus came to do. And that's what the restoration of everything is ultimately going to look like. The reason we tend to give up is because the price for reconciliation is steep. And we can't pay it. The only way things can be reconciled is if a payment is made and those who feel wronged demand that the payment be made, and those who are wronged say, and those who did wrong say, "We're not going to make the payment," and so the war just continues. But the Bible says Jesus came to bring the reconciliation, and we need to rest in him. That God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting man's sins against him. Jesus paid the price. That's what the cross means, is that the price for reconciliation has been paid by Jesus. You know, we need to be redeemed. The price of redemption is high. We look at the brokenness of this world and we say this world is absolutely irredeemable. Let's just give up. But the gospel says a Redeemer has come. And we can't redeem ourselves. And your life is irredeemable. But if you trust in the one who came to be your Redeemer, redemption will draw nigh. We need to justify ourselves, and the easiest way, the simplest way to justify yourself is to make excuses and to blame other people. You can find someone else to be the scapegoat. If you can find someone else to pay the price, and you can find someone else to bear the burden of your wrongs, then you can feel justified regardless of who you are. And that's the human condition. That's why it's so comfortable to look down on other people. That's why when something goes wrong at work, you always have to find someone to blame. And you know, one of the most uncomfortable or most disturbing places to find yourself in life is when you're being blamed for something that someone else did, or when you're bearing the punishment for something someone else did. But we all have this reflex of needing to justify ourselves and needing to find someone to blame. And then Jesus came and he said, "Put the blame on me and be reconciled." That's what the cross meant. God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting man's sins against him. Why does he not have to count man's sins against them? Because Jesus said, "Count all the sins on me." God made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, so that we might in him become the righteousness of God. The strife in our world, the strife in our nation, the strife in our cities, the strife in our homes, the strife in our schools is the worst thing, because it devastates what all of us need most urgently, the community and the connection that all of us needs. But God allows that, and it continues in our life for this reason, so that we will be driven back to our ultimate hope, the ultimate source of reconciliation, the ultimate source of redemption, the ultimate source of justification, the ultimate basis for unity in the work of Christ, in the sacrifice of Christ, in the suffering of Christ, in the condemnation of Christ, so that the guilty people like me and like you might be made free. And that we might be invited into the ultimate beloved community. Now there's an amazing verse, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 11. Talks about Jesus. And you know what it says? He is not ashamed to call us his brothers and sisters. Think about that. The perfect Son of God, the flawless Son of God, the holy Son of God, the only begotten Son of God said, let's expand the family. Let's invite other people in. Let's let someone else call God Father. Let me call them my brothers and sisters. That's the heart of the beloved community. the generosity of Jesus, the grace of Jesus, the invitation of Jesus into his family and into relationship with him. When we look at Jesus, we see the price of redemption, it's high. We see the price of reconciliation, it's extreme. We see the cost of justification, it's devastating. But then we see that the price has been paid by him. And so the challenge for you, the challenge for me, the challenge for all of us is to actually believe that and implement that in all of our areas. In our world, in our nation, in our city, in our schools, in our churches, and even amongst our families and our friends. This is the vision and the hope that God gives us. And this is the opportunity that he invites us to in and through the work of Christ. Beloved, let us love one another, because love comes from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God, because God is love. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you would forgive us for a lack of faith. Forgive us for living as if the redemption purchased by Christ, the justification we have because he bore our sins, the reconciliation we have because he paid our debts, as if that's not enough. Renew in us a faith in him, and I pray that that faith will be proven and will be shown to be real as we show love for one another and as we even work together right here, right now, to build the beloved community in this city and beyond. We pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.